The gavel struck like a thunderclap, echoing through the chamber as if it carried the weight of history itself. Viewers across the country leaned closer to their screens, drawn into a scene that felt less like a trial and more like the prelude to an ambush. Judge Judy, eyes sharp and unforgiving, leaned forward with that familiar mix of wit and intimidation, while Chief Justice John Roberts sat beside her, calm but calculating. The two of them, titans of authority, had prepared something more than a hearing. They had prepared a trap. Jasmine Crockett stood tall at the defendant's table, but the air around her was heavy, suffocating with suspicion and expectation. The cameras zoomed in on her face, capturing every flicker of composure, every blink that might hint at fear. Millions were watching, waiting for her to stumble. The spectacle had been staged to show the might of the bench against the defiance of a rising voice. Judy's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Congresswoman Crockett, do you deny the evidence placed before this court?" She held up a folder, thick and theatrical, the kind of prop designed less for justice and more for headlines. The audience gasped, not because they knew what was inside, but because they could feel the orchestration, the performance of power designed to corner her. Roberts added his weight with calm detachment, his words polished, his tone deliberate. "The people deserve the truth, Ms. Crockett, and today you will provide it." His eyes didn't waver. They locked on hers with the cold assurance of a man who believed he had already won. Crockett's heart must have pounded, but her face betrayed nothing. The hush in the chamber grew unbearable. Even the shuffle of papers seemed deafening. The judges exchanged a subtle glance, the kind that told every seasoned observer in the room they had rehearsed this. They had planned every step to push her into a corner from which no one could escape. And yet, the stillness that followed wasn't fear. It was something else. Something waiting. Something dangerous to those who thought they had cornered her. But what the cameras captured next would leave every spectator and millions at home completely stunned. It started weeks earlier with a headline that felt more like a declaration of war than a news update. Crockett summoned to face judicial panel over ethics violation. The story spread like wildfire, igniting talk shows, social media threads, and cable news segments that all asked the same question. Was Jasmine Crockett about to fall? To her supporters, the charges were laughable, fabricated noise designed to silence a rising star unafraid to speak uncomfortable truths. To her opponents, it was a long overdue reckoning. But to the country, this trial became something else entirely. A referendum on who gets to speak with authority in America. She wasn't just a freshman congresswoman from Texas anymore. She was a symbol young, unapologetically black, proud, and piercing through the noise with wit sharper than a courtroom objection. She had made headlines dismantling hypocrisy in congressional hearings, calling out double standards, and refusing to play polite in the face of disrespect. That made her dangerous. That made her a target. And so the stage was set. The judiciary, cloaked in the pretense of impartiality, chose not just any judge to preside. They summoned Judge Judy, a media icon known for her no-nonsense takedowns, and paired her with Chief Justice John Roberts, a man who spoke softly but carried the weight of institutional power. It wasn't just overkill. It was symbolic. TV justice and Supreme Court decorum joining forces to make an example out of her. The trial would be public, of course, live-streamed, televised, framed by every major outlet as the Showdown. CNN aired countdowns. Fox News called it the moment America reclaims civility. Influencers, comedians, and critics across the spectrum weighed in. Memes exploded before opening statements were even made. This wasn't just a hearing, it was a spectacle, and Jasmine Crockett stood at the center of it. Behind the scenes, staffers whispered about optics, about donors, about setting a precedent. Some even speculated that this wasn't about ethics at all. It was about power. A warning shot. A public, Ritual meant to remind every young leader of color what happens when they speak too loudly, shine too brightly, or challenge the wrong traditions. Yet Jasmine didn't flinch. She walked into the courtroom with her head high, her braids catching, the light like armor. Her team warned her to tone it down. She didn't. They told her to avoid eye contact with Judge Judy. She didn't. They said be cautious, play safe, apologize if necessary. She refused, because for her, this wasn't just about clearing her name. This was about something much bigger. It was about protecting the space she represented every kid who ever thought they had to shrink to be respected. Every daughter of immigrants who believed her voice was too accented, too emotional, too much to belong in rooms of power. And the cameras? They weren't just watching her. They were watching all of us, waiting to see if America would keep punishing pride when it didn't come in the right package. Because while the world was told she was walking into a courtroom, in reality, she was walking into an ambush. For decades, Judge Judith Sheindlin ruled television courtrooms with an iron voice and piercing stare. To millions, she was a no-nonsense crusader against excuses and stupidity. Her signature style cutting off defendants mid-sentence, reducing grown men to stammering messes made her a cultural icon. But that same sharp tongue, that same love of humiliation, made others wonder, was she really seeking justice or just spectacle? What few knew was how far her reach extended off-camera. After retirement from her syndicated courtroom empire, she cultivated relationships in real law circles cloaked in mentorships, media advisory roles, and political donations. When word leaked that she'd be co-chairing this televised judicial session with John Roberts himself, critics balked. What business did a TV judge have standing beside the Chief Justice of the United States? But insiders knew the answer. Symbolism. This wasn't just a trial. It was theater backed by real legal authority. Judy would provide the bite. Roberts would provide the robe. John Roberts, by contrast, wielded power with a much quieter blade. His rulings reshaped the nation without fanfare. He gutted the Voting Rights Act with a polished pen. He protected corporate interests with surgical precision. Always the moderate face, the voice of balance. But behind the smile was a man who had learned to weaponize procedure itself. He didn't need to shout to dominate, he simply let the rules do it for him. Together, they were a carefully constructed machine. One loud, one quiet, one theatrical, one technical, but both united in a shared vision. Control the narrative. Maintain. The hierarchy never let challengers rewrite the rules. Their history of crushing dissent was well documented. Roberts had once dismissed a groundbreaking argument on racial gerrymandering with a single sentence that sent civil rights lawyers reeling. Judy had berated young litigants, particularly women of color, for speaking too emotionally or disrespectfully in her courtroom. And now, standing before them, was Jasmine Crockett, a woman who embodied everything they quietly feared: youth, audacity, intellect, and visibility. To the public, it looked like an odd pairing. To the political class, it was genius. "It'll be a clean takedown," one strategist whispered to the press. "Judy handles the optics. Roberts makes it legally airtight. Crockett won't know what hit her." Anonymous sources leaked that the judges had already mapped out the key lines of questioning. They had planned for defiance. They had rehearsed for passion. They had contingency plans for any viral moment. This wasn't just oversight. It was strategy. Their confidence bordered on arrogance. "We will not be interrupted," Judy warned. In a pretrial interview, her voice clipped. "This is about accountability, nothing more." Roberts, in his usual measured tone, added, "We expect full cooperation from Congresswoman Crockett. She is entitled to speak, but within the bounds of decorum." That word decorum hung in the air like a threat. In private, staffers joked about the Crockett takedown. One aide reportedly said it would be the judicial equivalent of swatting a fly. Another leaked memo described the strategy as a procedural containment, designed to prevent Crockett from turning the hearing into a political circus. But this wasn't just containment, it was punishment. A warning to every other rising figure who dared to wield charisma, cultural fluency, and fearless conviction on a national stage. And that was the real goal: to make an example of her. To remind the public that no matter how far you rise, the system still holds the power to bring you down with a smile. Even the courtroom was curated for intimidation. Cameras were angled to place the judges higher, literally and figuratively. Crockett would appear seated, small, boxed in. The lighting was harsh. The sound would echo her every word. Every detail was curated to turn authority into atmosphere. And yet something shifted when she walked in. The press noticed it. Viewers sensed it. The dynamic wasn't playing out the way producers hoped. Judy's barbs didn't land the same. Roberts's precision felt oddly hollow. And Jasmine? She didn't shrink. She didn't stutter. She didn't sweat. They had crafted the perfect trap. But they forgot one thing. And yet, even with all their influence, they underestimated the one weapon Crockett carried into that chamber. Before the courtroom lights, before the headlines and hashtags, before she ever stood toe-to-toe with America's most powerful judges, Jasmine Crockett was just a girl growing up in St. Louis, Missouri, raised not by legacy, but by grit. Her father worked double shifts at the post office. Her mother, a public school teacher, taught ESL by day and graded papers deep into the night. In their modest home, justice wasn't an abstract concept, it was dinner-table conversation. The kind rooted in reality, in rent increases, in unfair suspensions, in neighbors who vanished after immigration raids. Jasmine learned early that the rules didn't always work the same for everyone, and more importantly, that staying silent never made things better. She was talkative, passionate, and too smart for some teachers who mistook her assertiveness for disruption. But instead of dulling her edges, she sharpened them. When told to speak softer, she learned to speak stronger. When told to wait her turn, she mastered timing. When told her tone was too much, she used it to command attention. Crockett earned her law degree not as a resume accessory, but as a tool. While her peers chased corporate firms and corner offices, she opened a practice that took on cases others wouldn't touch. Cases involving tenants facing eviction without notice, women of color fighting wrongful arrests, and undocumented families, trying to navigate a system designed to confuse and exclude them. She wasn't just representing them in court. She was standing where she had once stood, outside the gate, asking for entry. Her political rise came almost by accident. Activists kept asking her to speak. Organizers urged her to run. And when she did, no one expected her to win. She didn't have a political dynasty. She didn't have PAC money. But she had something more powerful: community. In her first campaign, for the Texas House, they called her too radical, too young, and too loud. Her opponent, a well-connected insider, mocked her campaign's small budget and lack of endorsements. On election night, she won by a landslide. But that didn't mean the fights ended. They just got bigger. As a state representative, she took the mic and made national news by challenging voter suppression bills with both eloquence and fire. One clip of her dressing down a committee chair who tried to silence her went viral within hours. In it, she didn't raise her voice. She raised the standard. She didn't call names. She called out hypocrisy. And that moment, it wasn't just applause-worthy. It was a warning shot to anyone who thought she could be sidelined. Still, when she entered Congress, the doubters returned. Capitol insiders whispered that she was style over substance, that she'd be another flash in the pan. She responded not with press releases, but with receipts, pulling late nights in committee hearings, dismantling bad faith arguments, and doing the one thing most newcomers feared: speaking without apology. Her strength didn't come from defiance alone. It came from discipline, from reading every footnote in proposed bills, from mastering parliamentary rules better than her challengers, from knowing how to pivot from policy to poetry in a single breath, connecting Section 5 of a housing statute to the lived reality of a grandmother being priced out of her home. And yet, even as her star rose, she remained the same. She answered her own DMs. She donated to local bail funds. She showed up at rallies without a press team. To her, representation wasn't about prestige. It was about presence. But that presence scared people, because she didn't fit the mold. She wore her hair natural. She quoted both Audre Lorde and the Constitution in the same sentence. She invoked God and grit and feminism and fire, all without ever asking permission. She wasn't what power expected power to look like. And so, when the ethics complaint came over a vague decorum violation stemming from a hearing where she refused to be shouted down, it didn't surprise her. Nor did it surprise her that the judicial panel was stacked, that the language of the complaint was as vague as it was damning, that the system had, once again, chosen to punish the tone of truth rather than the root of injustice. But what they didn't understand, what they never seemed to learn, is that Crockett wasn't forged in D.C. She was forged in struggle, in St. Louis, in Dallas, in courtrooms where judges tried to condescend, and in offices where senior attorneys questioned her competence before hearing her speak. She didn't just know the system, she had survived it. And now, she was ready to confront it head-on, which is why, when the gavel struck and the trap was sprung, Crockett didn't break. She rose. The questioning began like clockwork, sharp, fast, relentless. Judge Judy wasted no time setting the tone. "Congresswoman, are you aware that failure to comply with decorum standards constitutes a breach of ethical duty?" she snapped, her voice bouncing off the marble walls like a slap. Jasmine Crockett lifted her chin. "I'm aware of the standard, Your Honor. I'm also aware of how selectively it tends to be enforced." Roberts didn't flinch. "We're not here to discuss perceptions. We're here to determine whether your behavior brought disrepute to the institution." Disrepute. A word thrown around like a weapon, empty in its specificity but full in its implication. Crockett didn't respond immediately. She knew the game: rush an answer, get cut off, appear rattled. So she waited, measured. "I believe what brings disrepute to this institution," she said calmly, "is punishing candor while rewarding cowardice." Judy's gavel slammed. "You are not here to make speeches," and yet they kept asking the kinds of questions that required speeches to answer. Loaded, circular, designed not for clarity, but for entrapment. Would you say your tone was appropriate? Do you regret using language that may offend others? Do you think your constituency elected you to insult your colleagues? At every turn, Crockett's responses were clipped short. Her context denied, her words twisted, and each time she tried to reclaim the floor, Judy's voice rose louder. "Answer the question. Stick to yes or no. You're grandstanding," the gallery murmured. Even those who had come to see a takedown were starting to squirm. The imbalance was obvious. This wasn't an inquiry, it was an interrogation. Roberts leaned in, voice even, almost patronizing. "Ms. Crockett, would you agree that a public servant must be held to a higher standard of restraint?" She didn't blink. "I would. Which is why I restrained myself from saying what many Americans were thinking." Gasps. A few stifled laughs. Judy's face tightened. The trap wasn't working. They tried pivoting to procedure, highlighting obscure rules Crockett allegedly violated, citing statutes few in the room had even read. She countered calmly with precedent, with footnotes, with quiet precision that made their outrage feel louder, messier. Still, the pressure mounted. Her mic was cut mid-response twice. A video clip was introduced without prior notice, edited to remove the provocation that led to her rebuttal. Roberts called it illustrative, Crockett called it incomplete. "You're accusing the judiciary of misrepresentation?" he asked coldly. "I'm saying context matters, and if we erase it, then truth becomes whatever the powerful say it is." The room grew tense. For a moment, even Judy didn't speak. But the barrage resumed. Questions stacked on questions, interruptions layered on accusations. Crockett's poise never cracked. Her voice remained steady, her breathing even. But inside, anyone watching could see this wasn't just a hearing. It was a performance, staged, to break her will in real time. And yet, with every jab, she seemed to grow taller. The more they cornered her, the more centered she became. She started pausing, letting the silence do the heavy lifting. She began meeting Judy's glare not with defiance, but with something far more dangerous: composure. The judges had all the microphones, all the rules, all the institutional armor, but they were missing something. Something they didn't see until it was too late. Because while they were performing authority, Crockett was embodying it. And the audience? They were beginning to notice. The nation braced for her collapse, but instead, she delivered the moment that would change everything. For a long moment, the courtroom sat in tense silence. Crockett leaned slightly forward, hands clasped, eyes steady. Judge Judy had just fired off another condescending accusation, something about emotional outbursts unbecoming of office. The Chief Justice, stone-faced beside her, was preparing his next line of procedural scolding. The weight of two institutions pressed against one woman. And yet, Jasmine Crockett smiled. Not smugly, not sarcastically, but with the calm, quiet certainty of someone who had let her opponents talk long enough. "Your Honor," she began, voice low and smooth, "you mentioned emotional outbursts. You cited tone. You invoked decorum. I'd like to enter something into the record." She pulled out a printed transcript. The font was large, the highlights obvious. Judy leaned in. Roberts narrowed his eyes. "This is from your syndicated courtroom series," Crockett said. "Episode 1314. You shouted your words, not mine. 'Don't pee on my leg and tell me it's raining.' Now, was that civil discourse or passionate advocacy?" Gasps rippled through the room. The gallery froze. Even the stenographer's fingers hovered in midair. Judy's mouth opened. "Nothing came out?" "I'm just asking," Crockett said. "Because if volume and metaphor disqualify someone from public service, then you, ma'am, would be disbarred on syndication alone." A soft laugh escaped from somewhere in the back. Judy flushed. Roberts adjusted his glasses. "Congresswoman, let's keep this focused." "Oh, we are focused," Crockett said, turning to him. "Because I've read every ruling you've signed that concerns conduct, ethics, and standards. You claim to uphold neutrality, but in Shelby County versus Holder, you gutted voting protections based on a post-racial theory that has since been disproven in every measurable way. Voter suppression cases have increased in the wake of that decision. Is that the kind of restraint you're proud of?" Now it was Roberts who shifted. "I'm not on trial," he said tightly. "No," she replied, "but your decisions are." A murmur swept the crowd. For the first time, the balance in the room tilted. "See, the problem isn't my tone," she continued, rising from her seat. "It's that my tone comes with receipts. You want to talk about what brings disrepute to this institution? Let's talk about selective outrage. Let's talk about how women like me are called angry for defending ourselves, while men in power get to shout, sneer, and steamroll without consequence." She took a step forward, unshaken. "Let's talk about how decorum is a leash used to keep the bold in check, about how silence is rewarded, and truth is penalized when it makes people uncomfortable." Judge Judy tried to interject. "You're grandstanding." "No," Crockett said, locking eyes. "I'm surviving. In a system designed to break voices, like mine. And what you call grandstanding, others call breathing." The silence in the room was thick, electric. Phones began to light up. Hashtags were already being typed. Reporters stared, mouths slightly open. "And while we're on the subject," she said, flipping open a second document, "I'd like to read from the House Rules on Acceptable Conduct. Nowhere does it say that raising your voice invalidates your point. Nowhere does it say that composure is the only form of courage. You've weaponized interpretation. But the text? The law? That's still on my side." Roberts exhaled slowly. "Congresswoman," she didn't let him finish. "Chief Justice, you've spoken about preserving institutional integrity. I respect that, but let me offer another definition of integrity. Standing firm when it would be easier to shrink. Speaking plainly when others want you silenced. Owning your story when the world tries to rewrite it." She paused. "Let the weight of the words settle. That's why I won't apologize for how I speak, because what I say reflects the people who sent me here, and I won't clean up their pain to make it more palatable for a courtroom." It hit like thunder. The air shifted. Not a single eye blinked. Judy looked down. Roberts stared straight ahead, but the sharpness in his expression had dulled. They were no longer leading the narrative. Crockett was. One final push. "Before you judge me, ask yourselves, would I be sitting here if I looked different? If I spoke softer? If I smiled more, flinched more, asked for less?" She let that linger. "Because I don't think this hearing is about ethics. I think it's about power. And power doesn't like being questioned by the people it underestimated." She returned to her seat. Not slumped, not deflated, anchored. As if she had just turned the entire courtroom into her own. No gavel slammed. No questions followed. Even the judges seemed unsure of what to say next. Outside, on the courthouse steps, a crowd began to gather. Phones in hand, tears in eyes, applause rising. Inside, the cameras rolled quietly, capturing the shift, no longer a trial, but a turning point. But the drama didn't end in that chamber. It exploded far beyond those walls. Within minutes of Jasmine Crockett's final words, the internet detonated. The clip of her counterattack, precise, blistering, undeniable, was uploaded to social media before the courtroom microphones had even cooled. A single phrase from her testimony became the rallying cry, "I won't clean up their pain to make it more palatable for a courtroom." By noon, it had become a trending hashtag. #Speak like Crockett. It was on TikTok, stitched into videos of young women reciting her words while walking confidently through school hallways. It was on Instagram, framed in bold fonts over her photo, like a movie poster. It was on Twitter, captioning images of protest signs, political commentary, and stunned reactions from major pundits who never saw it coming. Cable news scrambled to keep up. CNN called her the firebrand who reshaped the power dynamic. MSNBC ran a chyron that read, "Jasmine Crockett doesn't flinch." Even conservative outlets caught between outrage and awe couldn't ignore the public's reaction. One Fox News panelist, clearly flustered, muttered, "That was unnervingly effective." Commentators across the political spectrum found themselves caught flat-footed. She wasn't supposed to win that room. She wasn't supposed to steal that spotlight. And yet, she had done more than survive the ambush. She had flipped the narrative. Celebrities began posting in support. Kerry Washington tweeted, "Jasmine Crockett just gave a masterclass in strength under fire." Questlove called her the people's gavel. Even those who had never heard of her 24 hours prior were reposting her speech with captions like, "Who is this queen?" and "This is what leadership looks like." Memes flooded the internet. One showed Judy and Roberts frozen mid-blink with the caption, "When the trap backfires." Another paired Crockett's now iconic courtroom pose with Beyoncé's "You Won't Break My Soul." Screenshots of her expression, calm, unbothered, defiant, became reaction images overnight. In the streets of Dallas, Murals began appearing spray paint tributes to the moment a daughter of St. Louis reminded the nation what accountability actually looked like. Even Congress felt the shock. Lawmakers who had previously kept their distance now posted their support. One senator shared the clip with the caption, "Truth doesn't need a mic, but when it gets one, history listens." Civil rights leaders issued statements praising her clarity. Community organizers printed her quotes on flyers, but the most powerful ripple wasn't in Washington or Hollywood. It was in living rooms, school cafeterias, barbershops, dorm halls, in the inboxes of teachers who were emailed the clip by their students, in the quiet messages from daughters to mothers that read, "This is who I want to be." Parents began posting videos of their kids watching Crockett speak, some barely old enough to read subtitles. And still, the message was clear. That woman in that courtroom was not broken. She was building something. For once, the media didn't just chase controversy. They followed conviction. Overnight, Crockett was booked on every major network, but she didn't rush to accept the spotlight. When she did appear, she chose to speak not of herself, but of service, of duty, of how many people had paved the way for her moment, and how many more needed the courage to claim theirs. And she didn't apologize. Not once. The ethics charge dropped within 48 hours. The panel issued a vague statement about respecting the Congresswoman's right to defend herself. But the public knew what that really meant. The system blinked first. It wasn't just a victory for Jasmine. It was a cultural shift, a reclamation, a reminder that power doesn't always wear a robe or carry a gavel. It sometimes walks in with braids, a binder, and a backbone. It was validation for the loud girls told to whisper, the brown kids told to blend in, the activists told to wait their turn. It was permission for a new generation to speak with fire and to know they would not stand alone. And yet, the final word of this story wasn't written in court. It was written in the hearts of millions. In her first public appearance after the trial, Jasmine Crockett stood behind a modest podium at a community center on the south side of Dallas. No cameras, no courtroom, no gavel, just folding chairs, plastic water bottles, and a room packed with people who had watched her take on two of the most powerful legal figures in America and win. She didn't speak of revenge. She didn't gloat. There were no headlines to chase, only clarity to deliver. "What happened in that courtroom," she began, "was never really about me." The room fell silent. It was about the cost of speaking plainly, about what we're willing to call unprofessional when truth makes us uncomfortable, about how systems dress up silence in the language of civility and call that justice. She looked out over the crowd, eyes meeting young faces in the front row. "But dignity," she said, "isn't earned through submission. It's earned by standing tall even when your knees are shaking, even when you're outnumbered." The message rippled through the room. Because she wasn't just telling her story anymore, she was handing it over. She spoke of her parents, of growing up watching her mother teach students how to say their names with pride, of her father reminding her that fairness wasn't always guaranteed, but courage always had value. "I was raised," she said, "to believe that respect should not require erasure." She spoke of politics not as a career, but as a kind of public stewardship. "We don't need more power for power's sake," she said. "We need more truth spoken without apology." And when she paused, it wasn't for effect. It was reverence for every voice that had messaged her, marched for her, prayed for her, for the movement that had taken shape not behind her, but beside her. "This trial," she said softly, "was meant to make me smaller. Instead, it made the truth louder." She reminded them that justice isn't only served in courtrooms or legislatures. It's served in classrooms, kitchens, sidewalks, and ballot boxes. "The next time someone tells you to watch your tone," she said, "tell them tone isn't the enemy tyranny is." The applause rose not in thunder but in waves steady, deep, grounded. People stood, not just in celebration, but in recognition. They weren't just witnessing a moment. They were stepping into it. Because Crockett had given them something more than vindication. She'd given them language, a blueprint, proof that when dignity faces down arrogance, it doesn't have to shout. It just has to stand firm. She closed with a message that was a half warning, half invitation. Power thinks it can control the story. But it forgot something. We are the storytellers now. Because this wasn't just a courtroom moment. It was a call to every American watching. Judge Judy and Chief Justice John Roberts thought they had the upper hand. They crafted the narrative, built the stage, and lit the fuse. But Jasmine Crockett didn't walk into that courtroom to play. Their game she walked in to rewrite the rules. What started as a public takedown became a national awakening. Every interruption, every trap, every smirk thrown her way was met not with fear, but with unshakable clarity. And when the moment came, she flipped the trial not with volume, but with truth. You watched it unfold. The tension, the reversal, the eruption that followed. You saw what happens when someone dares to stand their ground, not just for themselves, but for all of us who've ever been told to shrink, stay quiet, stay in line. This wasn't just a political drama. This was a mirror. And Jasmine Crockett didn't just reflect courage, she sparked it. So now, it's your turn. If her voice shook something in you, share this. Send it to a friend who needs to see strength that doesn't beg for permission. Drop a comment. Add your voice. Let the algorithm know that stories like this matter. Because they do. Subscribe if you believe in truth that bites back. Subscribe if you believe leadership looks like all of us. Subscribe because moments like this deserve more than applause. They deserve action. Because if one voice can flip the script in that courtroom, imagine what all of us can do together.